Good evening, gentlemen. This is the second and final slideshow for Chapter 4. So we're going to go ahead and get right to this. We have our list of the different topics that we'll be looking at in this section. That list continues here. And again, I would suggest you take note of these questions. Under objectives, pay special attention in being able to answer these and understand these not only for the oral quiz, of course, but for studying for the test as well. Now, diversity of living things. We're going to talk about all the living things on the planet. So we introduced ecosystems, and now we're going to talk about the diversity of living things, in particular, as biologists, how we categorize or classify them, and then that will play into our discussion on ecology in the next chapter. So, in terms of classifying living things, we have 3 domains and 4 kingdoms that we use, and we put living things into each of these. One of these domains or kingdoms based on different characteristics that they have and maintain. Members of the 3 domains get their food in different ways, and they have different types of cells. The cell is the smallest unit of biological organization. We recognize the cell to be the fundamental unit of life. And we are going to be able to have to understand that animal cells, plant cells, fungi cells, protists, they all have nuclei. They all contain nucleus, which makes them different from bacteria, other type of fungi, and plants, which have cell walls. Okay, so we're looking at the presence of nuclei or the absence of nuclei, and we're looking at the presence of cell walls or the absence of cell walls. That's generally what we're looking at in looking at living cells and how we classify or categorize them. This chart lays out for you, it's in your textbook. I'm not going to read all the specifics of this chart. I am going to tell you guys that you need to be able to know the differences of the 3 domains and then the kingdoms that are within the domains. So notice that you have the domain Archaea, domain Bacteria, and domain Eukarya. Notice under domain Eukarya, you have the kingdoms. Kingdom Fungi, Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Plantae, and Kingdom Animalia. So you're going to need to memorize this chart and be familiar with those. We're going to talk about each one in more specificity as we go through this section of the chapter. Archaea are different from bacteria, but we talk about archaea and bacteria similarly, but archaea are different from bacteria due to genetics and due to the makeup of their cell wall. Bacteria are microscopic. They are unicellular. The term unicellular means it is an organism that exists as one cell, and they usually have a cell wall, and bacteria will reproduce by cell division, which makes them very efficient, by the way. But where bacteria and archaea are the same is that they do not have nuclei. If you know anything about cell biology, this should raise a question, because we know in the typical cell that has a nucleus, that's where the DNA is found, and the DNA is the blueprint of life. In terms of bacteria, without having a nucleus, what they do have within their cytoplasm, floating around the interior of the bacterial cell, are little rings of DNA that we call plasmids, and that provides the amount of DNA or the amount of genes that the bacteria needs to carry out all the processes of life and to actually be a living organism. And what's interesting about these two is that we have now discovered that they live in every habitat on Earth. We actually find them in hot springs, places that we previously thought were uninhabitable by life, in the deepest, coldest parts of the ocean, even within the bodies of animals. So they are, the term we would use is they are ubiquitous. They exist everywhere. If we look at the role and the connection between bacteria and the environment, we and we connect this to the thinking about bacteria being ubiquitous or being everywhere. What we look at, what we see is that bacteria break down the remains and waste of other organisms. And so bacteria are very, very important. The reason that they're ubiquitous, the reason that they are everywhere, is that they are essential to decomposition. They take the nutrients that exist in dead and decaying things and they put them back into the soil, or more generally, back into the environment. They recycle nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which, if you're thinking, okay, are some of the things that we're testing in our soil analysis. So very, very important. And certain bacteria, in terms of nitrogen, can actually convert nitrogen that's in the air into a form that plants can use. And we can talk about this, but if you look at the legumes that have the nitrogen fixing bacteria, they actually take an unusable gaseous form of nitrogen in the air and turn it into a completely usable form of nitrogen in the soil for the plants. And nitrogen is extremely important because it's one of the main components of proteins and genetic material. So these organisms need to be able to have the nitrogen in a form that they can actually use. We see that bacteria are also important because they aid in digestion, or they aid other organisms in being able to get nutrients out of their food. For example, Escherichia coli, or E. coli, is a bacteria that's found in our intestines, and it's actually supposed to be there. It helps digest food, it helps release vitamins so that our body can absorb them. If you've ever been on an antibiotic for an infection, you recognize this, even though you may not have known what's happening. One of the common side effects of antibiotics is diarrhea, and that's because you take an antibiotic to kill bacteria, and specifically you want this antibiotic to kill the bacteria that's causing the infection, but very often the antibiotic will kill the normal flora or the normal bacteria in your body, and it will kill the bacteria in your gut, like the E. coli, and that will cause you to have stomach symptoms. And that's because the bacteria that are supposed to be there helping you to digest, helping you to extract nutrients is not there. Okay, so we have, termites are another example. Everybody thinks that termites eat wood. Termites are incapable of digesting wood, but they have bacteria that live in their guts that can. And so the termites chew on the wood, the bacteria digest the wood, the termites get nutrients out of it. So bacteria, we now understand, are very, very important to life on this planet. Not in any specific place or time, but just in general because of the roles that they play. We move on to fungi, or fungi. You'll hear it pronounced both ways. A fungus is an organism whose cells have nuclei and they have rigid cell walls, but they do not have chlorophyll. And so they belong to their own kingdom, the fungi kingdom. Okay? Very often people think of fungus, they see mushrooms and things like that. They think of them as plants because they look like something that's growing up out of the ground, but they are very, very different than plants. And because they have no chlorophyll, they do not produce their own food, so they are not autotrophs, and therefore they are not plants in the least. Their cell walls act like little skeletons that allow them to stand upright. You see the fungus, shelf fungus that grows off of a tree, or the mushrooms that grow straight up. It's their cell structures that allow for that. And the mushroom that we see above the ground is the reproductive structure. That's where the spores are released. But the mushroom is only one part, and there's a vast underground network of fibers that actually absorb food from decaying material in the soil or on the log, and that makes up the bulk of the fungus. The part that you see above ground is just the reproductive part. They actually get their food from outside of themselves. Okay, so they fall in the heterotroph category. They are decomposers. They're not autotrophs like plants. And the way that they get their food is by releasing chemicals. And those chemicals released, they help break down the matter, the organic matter, and then they're able to absorb it into themselves. Bodies of most fungi are huge networks of threads that grow through the soil, through the dead wood, any decomposing organic matter. If you are someone who eats mushrooms and likes mushrooms, those mushrooms are grown in a mushroom farm. There are lots of mushroom farms actually in Pennsylvania, and they literally are probably grown in caves or in dark buildings directly on top of piles of manure, not in the soil or anything else like a plant. And that's literally how they are grown, and because that is what they survive off of. And we know that because they're decomposers, they play a very important role in breaking down the bodies of dead organisms. Fungi, like bacteria, can cause disease. Okay, we talked about bacterial infections. Athlete's foot is an example of a condition that people get caused by fungi. Yeast infections. We had a dog years ago who constantly was a type of dog who was very prone to yeast infections in their ears. Yeast is a fungus, and that is also an example of a fungal infection. Thrush, babies and mothers, sometimes nursing mothers, babies will get thrush. We'll see this white covering and coating and patching in their mouths. I once was on an antibiotic for an extremely long time. It basically wiped out all of the bacteria within my body, and I had a terrible case of thrush inside of my mouth because the bacteria in my mouth was gone. It left a space in the ecosystem of my mouth for the fungus to go in and to grow. And so then I had to take an antifungal to get rid of the fungus. So we see these types of things happening all the time. But also there's an industrial and a food industry use for fungus. Blue cheese gets its flavor and its blue color from fungus. And of course the making of bread uses yeast, at least certain recipes. The making of beer and wine are fermented beverages that use yeast in order for the process to take place. So we see all those things happening as well. Protists. We move on to protists, and these are diverse organisms. They belong to the kingdom Protista. These can be amoebas, which are animal-like. Others are plant-like, kelp. Some are kind of like fungi. So protists is a very, very diverse kingdom, and the different organisms that we see in the protist kingdom can really lean or act like one type or another. They're kind of all across the board. Usually they're unicellular. Most protists are unicellular. Again, that's an organism that's made up of one cell. Usually they are microscopic. Diatoms are a classic one that are just fill the ocean and float on the surface of the ocean. They're quite interesting little creatures. Plasmodium is a unicellular organism that is a protist and causes malaria. Okay, so again we see these kind of across the board, but many of the unicellular type organisms that are out there are going to fall into the protist or kingdom Protista. And from point of environmental science and looking at the whole Earth and how everything interacts and works together, we see that algae end up being the most important protist. Algae are more plant-like. They can make their own food, so they do have some chlorophyll. They are autotrophs. They use light energy from the sun to do this. They can range in size from giant kelp, which is huge, to unicellular phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are the initial source of food in most ocean and freshwater ecosystems. So you'll see that algae tend to be at the beginning of most food webs or food chains. We'll move on to plants. Plants are multicellular. They make their own food using light energy from the sun. They have cell walls. That's the basic definition of a plant. Most plants live on land. and their leaves are very, very important appendages. They use their leaves to get sunlight, to get oxygen, and get carbon dioxide and give oxygen off. They have the roots, which are also very important appendages, absorb nutrients and waters from the soil that the roots are in. And we see that leaves and roots are connected by vascular tissue. So you got the leaf. If you think about your typical plant, leaves on top, roots on the bottom. But how are those connected? Well, you've got the stem in place. The stem is actually made up of vascular tissue, vascular like vessels. We have what we call xylem and phloem, and these are thick cell walls and tubes that carry the water and food to the different parts of the plants as they are needed. There are plants with no vascular tissue, no stem, so to speak, between the leaves and the roots, and we call them non-vascular plants. They don't have specialized tissues for conducting. They don't have root stems or leaves. So water is kind of just moves and absorbed into the whole plant and through the plant. And these would include things like mosses, which generally only exist and have to exist in damp areas because they have to be in contact with the moisture to absorb the moisture into the whole plant. Next are gymnosperms. These are within plants. Gymnosperms are woody vascular seed plants. The seeds are not enclosed by an ovary or a fruit. So to think about gymnosperms, you're typically thinking about the conifers, so the pine trees that bear cones, right? No fruit or no ovary for the seed. And the conifers are our number one source of our lumber and paper supply in America today. So very, very important. There is a huge lumber industry just in the very general vicinity that we're in here in Fork Union, and all the managed forests that around us are gymnosperms, are conifers. They have special adaptations, which live in dry conditions. These are the evergreen trees, by the way. They can produce pollen, can protect and move between plants, the sperm. They produce seeds, protect developing plants from drying out. And they have these needle-like leaves, right? The evergreens lose very little water and stay green all winter. Next are the angiosperms. So this is the counterpoint to the gymnosperms within Kingdom Plantae. Angiosperms are flowering plants, produce seeds within fruit. Most land plants are angiosperms. So when you look at a plant, let's look at the flower. The flower is the reproductive structure. Grasses have flowers. They're very small. Use wind to disperse their pollen. But other angiosperms have large flowers, and these large, colorful, fragrant flowers attract insects and birds. And those angiosperms are going to depend on animals to disperse their seeds, but also to carry their pollen. Pollinization happens mechanically as different animals, insects, or birds bring the pollen from plant A to plant B. Okay. And what we know in terms of ecology, and we'll start talking about this when we talk about food webs, is that most land animals are dependent on flowering plants. Most of the food we eat, wheat, rice, beans, oranges, lettuce, all come from flowering plants. So this process, even in terms of producing food for humans, is unbelievably important. Building materials and fibers, so oak and cotton, come from flowering plants. But you've got to think about something. If these flowering plants are so important, and flowering plants are generally pollinated by insects and animals, you've got to think about that. And it raises great questions regards to the honeybee shortage or the honeybee crisis that we've been experiencing over the recent years, last couple of decades, and some of these issues. What happens if you take that part of the equation away? Now, I'm not giving you an answer, but it's a question that ecologists and biologists look at. What does it mean when you have this equation, right? You've got angiosperms, you have flowering plants which need pollinators, and they produce all kinds of food stuff, and they produce all kinds of building materials. What happens when you take one piece of that equation away? When you take the pollinators out, or you take one of the pollinators out, honeybees are one of the main pollinators. You take that out, what happens to the whole rest of the system? Those are questions that are worth asking and worth looking at. Animals are next. Animals are heterotrophs. They cannot make their own food, so they need to take their food or they get their food from the environment around them. Animal cells do not have cell walls, so animals tend to be soft in their bodies and more flexible. We do see that some animals have hard, what we call exoskeletons, like insects, or hard skeletons inside, like mammals, that help them move from place to place and help them move their body through space. What this means, though, practically, is that animals are much more mobile than plants, and all animals move around in their environment during at least one stage in their lives. Within animals, we have invertebrates. They do not have backbones. And so most invertebrates are going to spend the better part of their lives attached to hard surfaces. In the ocean in particular, these are the filter feeders. They attach to one spot, they stay in that one spot, and they get their nourishment by filtering phytoplankton and such out of the water. The corals and various sea worms and the mollusks all are going to fall in that category. They're only mobile in their larval stage. And during that stage, they're actually part of the ocean's plankton. But once they hit a particular point in their development, they anchor onto a spot and they stay there. Invertebrates can also include squid in the ocean, insects on land. These are a little bit more movable and they actively move in search of food. In fact, when we start talking about insects, more insects exist on Earth than any other type of animal. So insects end up playing a vital, important role when we look at ecology and ecosystems. And insects have been studied and continue to be considered very successful. Why are they successful? They survive lots of different types of situations and circumstances. They have waterproof external skeleton. They can move quickly. They can reproduce quickly. Most insects can fly. Their small size allows them to live on little food and to be in small places where they can hide from their enemies, which would be, their enemies generally would be larger animals that eat them. And we have these symbiotic relationships that we recognize where insects and plants depend on each other. There's lots of different relationships you can see where they depend on each other to survive. Insects are very important for carrying pollen from male fruit parts to fertilize a plant's eggs. Tomatoes, cucumbers, apples, these would all be examples where you need the insect as the pollinator. And they eat other insects that we consider to be pests. If you are a gardener or you have an orchard or anything like that, you have options. You can get insecticides to get rid of the insects that are eating your plants. Or for example, if you have a problem with aphids will voraciously eat the leaves off of any plant, especially broad leaves. They'll voraciously eat them. You can actually get and encourage a population of ladybugs, which will not eat your plants and will cause no damage to your plants whatsoever, but love aphids and will actually work to keep the aphid population down. So, some interesting corollaries and connections there. Then we have the challenge between insects and humans that exists. We have the issue with the blood-sucking insects that transmit disease, malaria, sleeping sickness, West Nile virus, all generally connected to the mosquitoes, of course. And then you've got all the issue with the ticks and the Lyme disease and the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And we also have the issues with insects that do and can do tremendous damage directly by eating the crops that we are growing. That brings us to vertebrates, which are animals that have a backbone. These would be mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. So we see quite a variety that are in the vertebrate category. And we look at fish and we can look at reptiles. Again, I'm not going to be someone that presents to you an evolutionary explanation, discussing fish as the first vertebrates and then evolving into reptiles. So just so you guys understand that, the book is going to present that. So keep that in mind. With that being said, we do have lots of different examples of different types of vertebrates that exist, and there are lots of different what we can call or refer to as adaptations or design features that allow these animals to be successful. When you look at reptiles on land, they have, they lay waterproof eggs. These eggs are able to hatch on land and away from certain types of predators. So there's lots of different ways for us to talk about this and look at this. Just know all the different types of vertebrates. When we talk about birds, we see that birds are warm-blooded. And they have feathers. That's a unique feature. They have hard-shelled eggs. And they keep their eggs and their young warm until they develop their insulating layers of fat in their feathers. We see mammals are warm-blooded, and they have fur, and they feed their young milk. And, one of the things about being warm-blooded here is that birds and mammals have the ability to maintain their body temperature, which allows them to live in cold areas where other animals cannot. Hopefully you guys understand the difference between warm-blooded and cold-blooded. It doesn't mean if something's warm-blooded that it has warm blood, and if something's cold-blooded that it has cold blood. Warm-blooded just refers to that animal's ability to maintain its own body temperature. Its body temperature is not dependent on the temperature of the environment around it. Like, I'm recording this lecture on Saturday. It's snowing out. It's windy. It's, last I saw 24 degrees. With the wind, it felt like 12 degrees. When I go outside, my body is going to maintain 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? Reptiles, amphibians, those types of animals, doesn't mean that they're cold-blooded. It means that if it's 30 degrees out, they're going to be 30 degrees. If it's 80 degrees out, they're going to be 80 degrees. So that's the difference, and you want to understand that difference.